Greetings. Greetings, everyone. Welcome. As you come into the space, if you would open the chat and say hi, make sure to go to the second on the drop-down menu to everyone. And I'm Katthe. I'm joining from Wadsworth, Illinois, and I'm here with Letechia from Glenwood, Illinois. And this is Be Strong Families webinar series, staying strong and positive for ourselves and our children. We're here every day. Mondays and Wednesdays in English, Tuesdays and Thursdays in Spanish. Hi, Anna from Wichita, Kansas. Welcome.
Hi, Anna.
Who else is here? Hi, Michelle from Western New York. Some friends. Andrew's in the background. Thank you, Andrew, for being here and making sure everything goes smoothly.
All right.
Get started.
Hi, Charles from Evanston.
Hey, Charles likes to live in Evanston. Hi, Jennifer from Cal. And Stephanie from West Chicago.
Hello.
I'm wondering if Sandra's going to join us today. Renee Flora. Hi, Renee from Central Valley, California. It's great to see everyone here today. We have a small but mighty group today. And we have a really important topic. So glad that you could all join us. It's 12 o'clock, so let's get started. I'm going to buzz through our topic today. This is part of our Amplify Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series. And today we're going to be grappling with the realities of incarceration in the U.S. And I'm delighted to be here with my colleague and fellow co-founder of Be Strong Families, Letechia Holmes.
Good afternoon.
Great to see everybody. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to spend the first part of the webinar giving context and background. And I'm going to tell you that I'm not going to talk a lot in this. We have a lot of videos about incarceration in the U.S., short ones, pithy ones. But my intention was not so that I wouldn't be presenting and Letechia wouldn't be presenting, but we would just hear it from other experts. And then we're going to move into discussion based on our Amplify, our More Perfect Union deck, questions from the More Perfect Union deck. And we are live streaming to YouTube, and you're welcome to refer anybody afterwards to our YouTube channel, and other people can catch up there. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, Adrian. Ways to engage. You're doing it with the chat, and you see that little everyone, type your message here. Make sure it goes to everyone, because a lot of the interaction is with the chat. You're also able to speak if you want to be heard and your voice to be heard. You're welcome to speak. You raise your hand. Andrew will unmute you. You'll need to unmute yourself, and then you can speak. So whenever we do anything at Be Strong Families, we have agreements, and this is in recognition that we co-create this safe space together. So here are our agreements for today and for most of the webinars. If you agree to follow these agreements, just write "I agree" in the chat. Thank you, Jennifer, getting the ball rolling. And Renee. Let's see a few more "I agrees." Andrew, of course. Hi, Deborah and Adriana. Adrena? Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Perfect. Okay, so let's get started. Those of you, Adrena and Portia, you're going to want to direct it, and Renee, you need to direct your chat to everyone, because otherwise people aren't going to see what you type. So here we are with the context. In 2010, Michelle Alexander published a book called The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And it was a really, really important book for the topic that we have today. I credit her with popularizing or bringing to the national attention the issue of mass incarceration. Who has read the book? Charles, great book. Yes, I read it back in the day. I read it, I think, 10 years ago. And it's interesting, it's more than 10 years old now. And since Michelle Alexander brought it to attention, there's been a lot of work on this topic. So let's go to the next slide. We've got a couple people telling us what the reality is.
Good morning, John. It's Friday. A few weeks ago, a company called Visually emailed me and was like, "Hey, Hank, if you could do a high-quality animated video on any issue in the world, what would you choose?" Now, that was a hard choice, but I went with incarceration in America because it is messed up. Now, crime is also messed up. Bad things happen to good people, and that's terrible, and something should be done about it. Well, we send people to prison to be punished, and to prevent them from doing bad things again, and to deter others from breaking the law. Punishment, corrections, and deterrence. Now, we have this habit of thinking of prisoners as something very external to society. After all, there are literal walls between them and society, walls capped with razor wire and watched over by people with guns. But millions of prisoners are released each year. Today's prisoners are tomorrow's neighbors, so corrections should probably be the most important piece of the incarceration pie. Unfortunately, it is not. We are, however, really good at punishment. America has about 4% of the world's people and about 25% of the world's incarcerated people. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world. Over the last 30 years, that number has skyrocketed, increasing over 400%. 41% of American juveniles and young adults have been arrested by the time they turn 23. Children as young as 13 years old have been sentenced to die in prison. And our prisons violate international standards. Solitary confinement increases instability and violence in inmates and is considered by international law to be torture. But in America, it's not regulated by anyone except the prison officials. No judge, no jury. Arguably the most devastating form of punishment we enact in this country, and yet there is no appeals process. And you think it's hard to get a job in America? Well, we make it intentionally more difficult to get a job once you have a conviction on your record, not to mention just to live your life. Convicts are ineligible for welfare, student loans, public housing, food stamps, and are often socially disconnected from community and family support structures. So in addition to having high recidivism rates, they have very high rates of homelessness and suicide. Somewhere along the way, we started to think that being tough on crime meant being tough on criminals, but that's not the same thing. Punishment is only one piece of a much larger crime reduction pie. And it's an expensive one, with some institutions paying more than $100,000 per year per prisoner. Long prison sentences have helped to decrease crime, but no more than 25% of the decrease we've seen can be attributed to incarceration, and it costs far beyond just dollars. The cost is to people, to our country, to communities, to families, and to ourselves. The policy seems to be if you've committed a felony, we just give up on you. These wars on crime, wars on drugs, they are wars on people. The smart political move is to appear tough on crime because crime is scary, so we increased minimum sentences, we arrested more people, we sent more of them to prison. That's how we looked tough on crime, but the results are in. It's bad policy. It's cruel, it's short-sighted, and to continue this policy of mass incarceration would be foolish. We're living inside of a massive $75 billion per year failed experiment. 2010 was the first year in nearly 40 years that the number of incarcerated individuals in America did not increase. Policymakers are beginning to realize the magnitude of this failure, but there is a long way to go. John, I'll see you on Tuesday.
So that was a very fast-talking guy. Let's go to the next one. We have three answers to this.
Mass incarceration means that we've got a very high rate of incarceration historically, comparatively. And the other thing is the rate of incarceration is so high, so socially concentrated, that we're no longer incarcerating the individual, but we're incarcerating whole social groups. The rate of incarceration now is about 5 times higher than it was historically. Historically, it was 100 per 100,000. Now it's about 500 per 100,000. If we look at prison, if we add jail to that, it's about 700 per 100,000. Nowhere in the world incarcerates as much as we do. We've seen extremely high rates of exposure to the criminal justice system for African American men with very low levels of schooling. So if we think about black men who were born in the late 1970s and who are growing up through the American prison boom of the 1980s and the 1990s, the chances that they're going to serve time in state or federal prison if they dropped out of high school is about 70%. So going to prison for that group of black men with very low levels of schooling, that's become a normal life event. And that's really only happened in the last 10 years. We're at this point now where there's about 1.2 million African American children with a parent who's incarcerated. And that's about 1 in 9. The research shows the kids who experience parental incarceration have diminished school achievement, they have behavioural problems, depressive symptoms, acting out. And there's also evidence that these kinds of negative effects associated with parental incarceration are concentrated more among boys than among girls. And there's a very real risk here that incarceration becomes an inherited trait. The underlying issue is we've chosen prison as a way to respond to that problem of crime. And there are a whole variety of ways that we could have chosen to respond to that problem of crime. We've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty. And we've chosen the response of the deprivation of liberty for a historically aggrieved group whose liberty in the United States was never firmly established to begin with.
Okay, next, please. This is Cory Booker.
Mass incarceration is warehousing the potential of millions of American citizens, perpetuating old racial injustices, and shortchanging taxpayers with an immense price tag. Frequently, I encounter those who struggle to move forward after being incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. And there are millions more who could tell similar stories of frustration, denied opportunity, and despair. While our nation is home to 5% of the world's population, we house nearly 25% of its prisoners. The federal prison population has increased by nearly 800% over the past 30 years. The explosion of America's prison population is strongly correlated with the so-called war on drugs. There are more people incarcerated today for drug offenses alone than all the people incarcerated in 1970 when the war on drugs began. Nearly 3/4 of the federal prison population is comprised of nonviolent offenders. The U.S. spends over $250 billion a year on the criminal justice system. Imagine where we would be as a country if we could take just a fraction of that and spend it on infrastructure projects to fix our crumbling roads and bridges. Or if we were able to spend some of the $250 billion improving education for our kids. African Americans and Latinos are far more likely to be arrested for selling or possessing drugs, even though studies have shown that African Americans and whites use drugs at the same rate, and whites are actually more likely to sell drugs. What's worst of all is that more incarceration does not necessarily lead to fewer crime. Cory Booker. If you agree it's time to rethink mass incarceration, share this video with your friends.
It is traumatic to a community when disproportionately there is an absence of men in the community because so many of them are serving such long sentences. You know, and having a parent that's in prison, you don't have your mom supporting you through life, or you don't have your dad encouraging you in ways that are necessary to develop. They're also wearing the burdens of their parents' crime. They didn't commit a crime.
My mother was incarcerated when I was younger. I was a baby, and I went into foster care.
I was in my mom's belly when he went to jail. When my dad gets out, I'll be 15.
My dad is so far.
They gave my dad 20 years, and that's a long time.
A growing number of American prisons are now contracted out as for-profit businesses to for-profit companies. The companies are paid by the state, and their profit depends on spending as little as possible on the prisoners and the prisons.
The reason why we like the private prison industry from a stock investment perspective, we think that there's substantial opportunity for growth. In 2004, there was about 6% market share. 2014, 8.3%. Over the past 10 years, they gained about 35%. It's an interesting and compelling investment opportunity for a lot of investors today.
Okay. The point of showing you all those videos is to kind of make the point that this is not something that's negotiable or debatable, that we do have a situation with incarceration in the US that is extremely real, and there's not a lot of controversy about it. It's been well studied. Andrew, next slide, please. I want to get through the slides. So this is for those of you who are visual learners and the auditory, the videos don't work as well. We just have the Sentencing Project has these criminal justice facts. So this is what you've heard before in the two videos, that our international rates of incarceration per 100,000 are higher. I don't know where North Korea is on this one, because North Korea was on one of the other ones as being pretty high, but we are higher than any other country. And if you look at the European countries, or other, we're extremely much higher. So that's the first fact. Next fact, Andrew. That throughout this is from 1925 to 2019, and it starts going up in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, the late 70s, early 80s. So you can see that. And other countries, this didn't happen in. Other countries, it stays about, that number per 100,000. We have, as the video said, chosen incarceration as a way to deal with a lot of crimes and with the effect that is not shown to be effective. Let's go to the next slide. How did it happen? We started sending more people to prison. The federal level, people incarcerated on a drug conviction make up nearly half of the prison population. At the state level, the number of people in prison for drug offenses has increased 9 times since 1980, although it's been declining since 2010. And most are not high-level actors in the drug trade, and most have no prior criminal record for a violent offense. So this is people in prison and jail 1980 versus 2019. Next slide. And we started sending people to prison for much longer terms. 1 in 7 people in prison are serving life with parole, life without parole, or virtual life, 50 years or more. In 1986, people released after serving time for a federal drug offense had spent an average of 22 months in prison. By 2004, people convicted on federal drug offenses were expected to serve almost 3 times that, 62 months in prison. Next slide. And it has not touched all communities equally. We saw that from the videos as well. Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white men, and Latinos 2.5 times as likely. So yes, we've incarcerated more people in general, but it's had a disproportionate effect on different populations and different communities and different groups of children. Let's move to the next slide. And all this is available online. Why it's not effective? They said in the videos 25% of the decrease in crime can be attributed to incarceration, increased incarceration, but that's the National Research Council. The impact is one of diminishing returns because, and this is important, recidivism rates decline markedly with age. So lengthy prison sentences, unless they specifically target very high rate or extremely dangerous offenders, are an inefficient approach to preventing crime by incapacitation. It means that in people that commit crimes like drug-related crimes, in their 20s are probably not going to be doing that in their 50s or their 40s or their 30s. unless they're, it's a very dangerous sociopathic psychopath, that is being imprisoned for a violent offense. Yes, those people are more likely to continue committing crimes, but most people age out of committing crimes. That's why excessive sentencing practices in the US are largely counterproductive and extremely costly. Next slide. So I just wanted to put something in here about what we could do instead. So you can read this slide yourself, but the suggestions made by the Sentencing Project are, again, suggestions made by most people who are interested in reform. So eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, cutting back on excessively lengthy sentences, shifting resources to community-based prevention and treatment for substance abuse, investing in interventions that promote strong youth development and respond to delinquency in age-appropriate and evidence-based ways, examining racial inequity at every stage of the justice system. So that includes, people who are let out on parole, people who, the sentences that are given, people for the same crimes, but racially biased sentencing. So just at every stage, what are the policies, what are the practices, conscious or not, that contribute to racial inequity? And then removing barriers that make it harder for individuals with criminal records to turn their lives around. I mean, if the premise is crime, punishment, even if that's the premise, then once the punishment is over, the punishment should be over, and it's not. Next slide. So this has impact on people. It also has impact on communities. So let's start hearing Mr. Drucker here.
Gone to prison because the drug laws of the late 70s, the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, where we were, came into effect with long mandatory sentences, and everybody was in jail. Everybody was in prison, coming in, going out, disrupting their lives, becoming homeless. And in the meantime, during this period, the Bronx was burning as well. So it was a very, very dramatic moment.
Everything we know about public safety says that there's a very limited relationship between what the criminal justice system does and the amount of crime, public safety. That's not zero, but it's a small relationship. What produces public safety is what people call informal social control, meaning family members, close personal relationships, institutions like schools, institutions like social clubs, and so on. And when you have neighborhoods that have large numbers of people missing because they're cycling through the prison system, you destabilize all of the foundations of informal social control. So what you've done when you have 25% of the men locked up on any given day, for example, or 2/3 of the men will get locked up sometime within a 10-year period, what you do is you make it so it's impossible for that particular community, that neighborhood, to get the foundation for informal social control for families, for relationships, for institutions like schools, and so crime rates go up.
But to characterize it as something that's eating the social capital, human capital, out of the black communities in the United States, especially over the last 40 years at enormous cost. So it's trauma to the individual who's exposed and their family, and then if every other family in your apartment house is going through this, it's a mass trauma. I've written a book called The Plague of Prisons, which is the epidemiology of mass incarceration in America. It tries to make the point that through our system of laws and punishments, we've created an epidemic that's taken on a life of its own.
Being a nation that has 5% of the world's population, but incarcerates 25% of the world's prisoners, it becomes real clear that we all have a stake in this.
Most social democracies, certainly wealthy ones like this, don't have that problem. You travel in these countries, you don't see the same things, and accordingly they have their prison populations are similar to what they were 30 or 40 years ago. It's about 100 per 100,000. We're up to 700 per 100,000. Decarceration is the next book, and what that has to do with is not only getting people out of prison, which is beginning to happen already, and God willing will go on, but also getting prison out of people. Decarceration is an end of the reliance on punishment, basically, as the only response that we make to our social problems.
Next slide, please. Enter. So I just wanted to make the point with this slide that the gateway, the Child Welfare Information Gateway, has a lot of resources on supporting children and families affected by parental incarceration, because it's recognized by the federal government and others that parental incarceration disrupts family relationships and produces lots of negative outcomes for children, and that it damages the parenting skills of the mothers and fathers who are incarcerated, and interferes with the ability of the parent and child to form or maintain a strong attachment, which may sound like, yeah, duh, but I guess there are a lot of resources, there are a lot of awareness growing about the impact of incarceration, parental incarceration on children. And I think this is our last video, Andrew. Is that the next slide, which is Brittany Paget Cunningham on the impact on children.
Because we have to not just think about the school to prison pipeline, but really the cradle to prison pipeline. And in my view, I kind of see 4 steps, right? So there are a lot of children who are essentially born into this culture, right? Now, there are children who are literally born into this. There are 12,000 pregnant women imprisoned every single year in this country. And there are 28 states that have no laws disallowing what's called shackling during birth. So the mothers are actually shackled while they're giving birth, which not only for any of the women who have given birth in here, if you can imagine not being able to move your body to be more comfortable during the most painful experience of your life. So it's difficult for the mother, but it's also very difficult for the child because it makes it much harder for the doctors to deliver a healthy baby. So you've got children who are literally born into this, but also this broader culture that Clint has already walked us through, that are born into communities that have been completely destroyed by mass incarceration, the war on drugs, et cetera. And so you're born into this idea that you start to internalize that the people who look like you, the people in your zip code, the people in your neighborhood are somehow inherently more criminal than the folks you might see on TV, the folks across town, et cetera, right? So first you're born into this culture. Then you're disciplined into it once you get into school. I remember we were training our teachers in St. Louis, and I went to one of the schools where someone else was in charge, but one of my staff members was there to observe a teacher. And she called me and said, I need you to come down here immediately. And I came down to find a 7-year-old handcuffed to a chair. I don't know what a 7-year-old could possibly have done that bad that he could be handcuffed to a chair. And the story that I was told certainly did not meet the bar for that kind of restriction. But we have to recognize that the culture of education in this country is one of compliance and not of empowerment, right? So if it's all about controlling your body and controlling the way that you move, controlling how much you move, then yeah, it would actually unfortunately make sense that a 7-year-old is handcuffed to a chair if people feel like they can't control him, right? Instead of having a conversation, instead of asking what's wrong, that's the solution. I talked to a friend of mine yesterday whose sister pulled her son out of a school 3 days into the school year because she said the kids wear orange uniforms, and her son kept coming home saying, I can't sit the way that they want me to sit for 45 minutes, mommy. And so again, this idea that compliance and restriction is better than empowerment is what we as adults come into the education space thinking is right, and yet it is deeply problematic for children. So imagine coming from a culture that says somehow the way that people like me behave is criminal, and then I come into an institution that tells me the same thing, that gives me the same message. I'm continuously internalizing this idea. Then we are, the governor talked about a criminal justice revolution. Well, our young people are discouraged from revolution from the very beginning. So here's what's really interesting, and Amanda Ripley has done some really important reporting on this. There are 22 states that have laws against what's called disturbance in schools, right? So this is what I mean when I talk about criminalizing everyday childhood behaviors. As you said, all of us were teachers. We've all been disturbed. we were all disturbances at some point when we were students. But because I was at a multiple intelligences private school, my disturbance were seen as creative or something to talk to my mother about during parent-teacher conferences. It wasn't seen as criminal, right? For so many of our young people, it's seen as criminal. And a lot of these videos that we've seen gone viral, the thing that happens in schools where we see, officers throwing kids and kids getting shackled and stuff like that. The thing that happens behind the scene is that often the young person who put out the video is actually admonished for disturbance. And in 22 states, that's a criminal offense, right? So kids are everything from expelled to actually seeing criminal charges brought against them simply for telling the truth. And if you're discouraged from telling the truth as early as elementary school, then you can bet that that criminal justice revolution that we need is not going to come. So you're born into it, you're disciplined into it, you're discouraged from revolutionizing it.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, Andrew. So we got to the end of our providing context for incarceration in the U.S. and grappling with the realities. And now we're going to go on to questions from our Amplify from the More Perfect Union deck. But we're going to start with a bridge conversation. I'm going to ask Letechia to respond to the first question, and then also open it up the floor for everybody else to respond to the first question. So the first question is, how does this reality of mass incarceration affect your family and your parenting?
Thank you, Katthe. It is my pleasure. So how does mass incarceration affect my family? So how this has affected my family is there's a number of stories that I can share, but three particular ones that's in that I feel like is very fitting here is all related to my brother is one, a brother-in-law, and my cousin. My brother, who is now 41 years old, he served 17 straight years in prison from the age of 19 to 38 years old, all for a non-criminal situation. Non-criminal. And say that again, Katthe?
Unviolent, right?
Unviolent, yes, for a non-unviolent situation he did. And the struggle we had with this is that he served 17 straight years. And so once he was released after serving this time, it was very hard for him to come back into the community and to in his family, because there was a lot of stigma, a lot of things that played against, even to the fact that he served this amount of time internally being in prison and then trying to reconnect with the community and the family in a place that was kind of foreign to him, and being that he is a parent as well, this is a challenge with how his children even see him, because now when they were young, when he went in, they were young. And now they are young adults and adults. And so for him to try to think about what parenting looks like or could look like, it's even more of a challenge when he's trying to figure out how does he feel normalized in a community that has rejected him and he feels rejected. And because of that, he wasn't able to get connected to the things that he needed, job, finding housing and being in the areas that he was in, because he had these marks on his back. One of them was he was now acknowledged as a pedophile. So him going back into the community, he can't live anywhere near schools or where elders stay, because his information has to be shared in that community. And so these things have impacted our family, because many of us have children or live in these areas, and it's a challenge in having them even visit. And so because of that, it made him feel demoralized. He actually wound up spending those 2 years in and out, backwards and forwards, because he was trying to figure out what his place would be. And so that totaled up 19 years. So it's not as easy once they go into prison and trying to get back out into the community and become a part of the community again, because the community don't play nice with them because of all of the things that he's been through. Same way with my cousin. My cousin was married. And because he disciplined one of his stepchildren, she went to school and she had said that he touched her and that she harmed her. And as a result of that, being in the state that they lived in, the lawyer that the mom and my younger cousin, which was his stepdaughter, was able to work with them and convince them in a way to kind of change their story a bit after a whole year of time of him trying to fight against this allegation that was made against him. And in the end, he wind up losing. But again, we're talking about a 36-year-old father who is now serving as a result of this situation that they still wasn't really able to really fully prove whether these things happen or not, is that he went in at 36 years old and he has been sentenced to 21 years for this situation in prison. And then in addition to the 21 years that he's been charged with to serve in prison, he will have, upon his release, 22 years that he will have to serve on parole. He will be 79 years old once all of this is done. And this was from one allegation from his 16-year-old stepdaughter who did not want to be disciplined or felt like his form of discipline was wrong. So now his family, since then being in there, his family has, really has been divided. His ex-wife and the children have moved away to another state, started a whole new life, and he has lost his mom since she's been there. So we don't know what life is going to be like or what that's going to look like for him coming out all these years later for this nonviolent crime, right? And so then you heard me in the final of this story is that I have a brother-in-law who was recently his sentence was serving a lifetime sentence for, again, a nonviolent situation that he served. And due to the prison system and a lot of work his sentence was overturned after 34 years. They released him and he's been home for 6 months, but it hasn't necessarily been as easy. And thank goodness, one of the ways of him being able to come back into the community and try to figure out what does his life look like now, what it could possibly be, is that my husband worked for a organization who is second chance to people who have been incarcerated or have been incarcerated and trying to re-enlist into the community. So through that, he was able to get connected with a job so that he can be able to provide for himself, because there's only so much time that he have to be in a halfway house. And still, after 34 years, a lot has changed since him going in and to come out now. And we all as a family is trying to figure out, still working together to figure out how do we keep them engaged? How, especially from my brother to my brother-in-law, keeping them engaged and let them know they are a vital part of the family, as well as who their children are now, and what that relationship could look like. But it's not easy because society is not really nice to those who have been incarcerated. They either label as the bad people or the ones you have to watch out for. And that can do a lot mentally to a person. And so both of them, have their own, although they have their own journeys, they're both heavily affected by it. And the family, as a family, is heavily affected by it, because we know a lot of how their way of living or thinking has had to do with the time that they have spent being incarcerated, which looks very different on the outside. So as fathers, as men, it's really hard to really look at that as a family and how do their own families and how do they be well received and respected. And my own parenting, for me, I feel like the role is to continue to educate my children, even as adults, and my grandchildren, and what the possibilities is and what life can look like. And, just having those hard conversations to do good in society, and, and try to do everything you can to stay out of the way of, these things that could cause incarceration or cause you to be incarcerated or separated from your family, because trying to get back into the community is not hard. So continuous education, continuous building awareness and knowledge around this situation, and especially as people of color.
Thank you so much, Letechia.
You're welcome.
Sharing all of that about your story and your family. I really, really appreciate it. Really.
Thank you.
Who else would like to share? How does the reality of mass incarceration affect your family and your parenting? Systemic racisms?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. How's it affecting your family? Your parenting? Portia, would you like to unmute yourself and speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. There are situations within not just the African American community, but we have to look at in the Hispanic community, but the states like Texas, and Indiana and Florida, the way the laws are written, where one person can do one thing and maybe get 2 years, and then the same thing happens and they're incarcerated for 25 and 50 years in the state of Texas. I wish Texas could reform. I have a brother who has been incarcerated for a long time, and he was released after 25 years for a drug possession on campus, but the roommate that was actually the drug dealer, because of his father's prominence in the community at Texas A&M, he didn't do nothing but the overnight, because they assumed that because my brother was Black, he was actually the drug dealer, and he was just the roommate who participated in the drug use. However, 25 years in him being released, a couple of violations and not getting to parole or to talk to the probation officer on time, because my mom's being elderly, not truly, moving fast enough, and he's back in prison again. But the effect that it has on the family, that, the kids and the grandkids and the nieces and nephews, they wear this with them. And so years ago, I'm a mother of 5 sons, and dealing with my sons, watching us having to go be incarcerated to visit with my brother, I taught my sons that, the true reality of what all Black and brown people should share with their children. It was shared with me, and that was that 5 Black or brown men, only one will possibly survive, because 2 will probably spend most of their life incarcerated and not be able to have children. And the other 2 will probably die in this situation before 25 of some violence in the community. And so you have that one that may survive to be productive in their community. And if we just drill to our Black and brown youth the ails of what happens when they just do not want to live and follow the laws of the land. So when I think in terms of, my brother was incarcerated for participating in drug use on a college campus, had he not understood the consequences of what could happen, because he wasn't following the law. So we've got to teach our children that they have got to model themselves in a way where they don't even can put themselves in situations where they can be incarcerated because they have a will and a pride that they want to live each day following the laws of the land. And I just wish we could impart that more to our young people because of the system and because of the racial injustice to Black and brown people when sentencing and false accusations and having them go to jail as innocent victims. We've got to empower our young people to know this. Be a number one.
Thank you so much, Portia. Thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for both your, both sides of it. I really appreciate your transparency and your vulnerability. Deanne in the chat says students suffer so much from this, as well as the effect on grandparents who are raising grandchildren. And Renee says she doesn't think she's doing enough in her current role working in a nonprofit contracted with probation. What change can I make today? And let's go to the next question.
Katthe, it looks like we had a hand raised from Adriana.
Yes. 1 second. How do you talk to your kids? Yes, Adriana, are you going to answer the first question or about how does it affect your family and your parenting? Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to say that I live in Los Angeles County and we elected a different prosecutor, and the rules have completely changed here in Los Angeles. The jails, our private jails, have been closed down, and the thin blue line people like to call it catch and release, but honestly, from a citizen perspective here, we're just not seeing, horrific things happening right and left. In fact, what we're seeing is a gentling in many ways. There is petty crime, and that is up. And by that, I mean like
Adrian, I want to cut you off just a second because I'm not hearing about how it affects mass incarceration affects your parenting or your family.
It does. So it does because, in the past, we might have taken a heavier hand with our children and said, if you do this, the police are going to come and get you, or, use deterrence like that, deterrent words. But we can't do that anymore because it's really not true in Los Angeles County at all. In fact, they're very hands off. And I just haven't seen anything really horrific going on. I haven't seen these like humongous statistics changing when you look at the larger statistics, worldwide with like suicide and violence. You're really not seeing anything like, horrific like they anticipated telling us with Gascon. So what I'm seeing in my community and with myself is that we're really parenting from love, and we're talking about things that are different with our children, and we're uplifting them instead of downlifting them through fear. And that's really what's changed. And I can't really speak on a personal level from people going in to incarceration, but I can speak in terms of therapy and pulling people together because of other nonviolent situations. And I think that it's working, and it's going to take some time to change society, but we have to keep going in the direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Adrian. And let's go to the next question. How do you talk to your kids about a family? These are questions from our More Perfect Union deck. I mean, the context is mass incarceration, but the questions are about, given this context, how do you talk to your kids about a family friend or a family member who has served time? How do you talk to your kids about a family friend or a family member who has served time? So Renee says parents also need support in understanding child and adolescent growth, normalizing testing their parents' rebellion and the like. As Adrienne said, it come at youth with love. Yeah, so there's also a lot of love that has to do with protecting your children and having them understand what the consequences are for behavior, and that the disproportionate consequences and the realities of what can happen to you versus what can happen to your friend. I think Portia's story is very instructive, and I encountered that a lot growing. My son is from Ethiopia, and so he's Black. He's an African American, like, and when he was in high school, he tried, it's normal to experiment. He was trying things, and there were the white kids who were the ones who were selling the drugs and were he was always the one that the parents thought was responsible. The white parents thought that he was the one. He was always kind of, because he was Black, so. And that was extremely, as a white mom, that was extremely frustrating. I can imagine how that it was for Portia also, is that, you've got the statistics say that white kids and white people use and sell drugs and use drugs at the same rate. White people sell more drugs, but if you're the Black kid in a predominantly white situation, you're likely to be the one that's targeted. And to me, it is loving to let your kids know that up front. It's not about fear. But Deanne says, this is a great question. How do you talk to your kids about a family friend or a family member who's turned side? I think part of removing stigma is by talking about it. And the reality is that everyone who's in prison is not a bad person. Everyone in prison is not guilty of what they were charged with. Some people thought taking a plea deal was all they could do. Yeah, and that's like when we were looking at the videos about what happens at every stage of the justice system. If you have representation from a public defender, most likely, if you don't have money for an expensive lawyer, most likely you're going to end up being pressured to take a plea deal. And Deanne agreed with the plea deal, and Renee agrees with that. And Lindsay says, I talk to my kids about it honestly. Kids can understand complexity. So we do talk age appropriately about different systems in place, mental health, illness, poverty, drug use, trauma, et cetera, and how that plays into why someone may be incarcerated. Thank you. Let's go to the next question. How do you have a positive conversation with your children about racial bias in the law, and at what age? So this is the question about the conversation, the conversation where, when do you have this conversation about racial bias in the law? What age? Portia says, if you're honest and Christ-like, people who have done anything criminal should be forgiven, and teach not to let a person pass define them, no judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Before middle school. Have the conversation before middle school.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Adrian says yes.
Mm-hmm.
Next question. We're powering through the questions now. How do you teach your children to interact with the police? Difficult conversation, but important. Yes. Mm-hmm. How do you teach your children to interact with the police? I bet, Letechia, you and I taught our kids to pretty similarly, right?
Oh, yes. Look, keep your hands visible. Only speak when you're spoken to. Don't do a lot of movement, and make sure you let them know what you're doing, because it could turn ugly.
And
If you don't do those things.
I also emphasize to be extremely polite and respectful, not to be smart. And so, I mean, because kids go through different stages. And as somebody said earlier, you know, it's kind of normal adolescent behavior to be a little mouthy for people, or to be disrespectful of adults, or to, you know, like be, you know, like, I already answered that question. Like, you know, why are you asking me and not him? You know, like that kind of thing, you know, and just that doesn't work at all. That you have yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, extremely, extremely polite, because it's a dangerous situation. It's a dangerous situation.
Yes.
Deanne says, I think we have to approach conversations with truthfulness, but also with compassion and empathy. And Portia says, oh my God, for Black and brown, that talk is not the same as for others. Yes, and we find this, Portia, also in our More Perfect Union Café conversations. That's one of, I think, the best things that comes out when you have people who are different sitting at the table talking about how they teach their children to interact with the police. I mean, where I grew up, the way my parents taught me to interact with the police was the police were my friends. You know, the police were there to make it safe for me. If I had any problem, you know, the police was a safe place, you know, for me to go. And that's, I think, a lot of times, I mean, speaking as a white woman and as someone who grew up as a white woman with white parents, that's what I was taught. And that's not, unfortunately, that's not necessarily what you can unequivocally say to a child who is a person of color.
That's true.
They're professionals, but we have to kiss their ass to live or not get put into prison. Ooh, that's like
that's real right there. That's real. Thank you for your honesty.
Yes. They are the professionals. They have the power. It's also, they have the power, they have the authority. And it's you know, power and authority are important concepts for kids to get, you know. And I think that, I don't know, I could go on a soapbox there, but I think that whole respect for power and authority for the position, regardless of who's occupying it or what their attitudes are, is an important survival skill. And Portia says, our kids fear being pulled over. Yes. Lindsay said, going back to the previous question, I think that choosing an age to start talking about racial bias in the law is in itself a privileged position to have. The idea is imposed on Black and brown children at a young age with no choice. We have to start talking with our children about race and bias early. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for pointing that out. And I think, you know, like Monday's webinar, 0 to 3 has a program or resources for teaching children about social justice from birth, you know. So I think it's a responsibility that all of us have to be, if we want to live in a just society together, to like start conversations early, not only specifically about racial bias, but about justice. And Adriana says, I agree. And to comply with police orders and not be disrespectful, especially if they know they did something wrong, and accept their wrongdoing and potential consequences. I think it's important to let them know that our choices and decisions have consequences, either positive or negative, and it's important to make right ones. We also have to take accountability of our choices and actions. Yes. Thank you, Adriana. That's a very great points, Lindsay. I agree, Lindsay. And Deanne says, I've never really seen effective community policing. And Alexandra says, yes, very true, Lindsay. Yes, so Lindsay, props.
Yes.
And so I guess, Lindsay, when you say we have to start talking with our children about race and bias early, what do those conversations look like? How do you talk to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old? Charles says, when will the police take accountability for their actions? That's a good question. Portia says, officer friendly is an experience of the past. We replace them with mental health units. That was one of the points in the video too, right? That there's a lot of different kinds of services that we could be paying for if we weren't paying for mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll ask the last question. If you were returning from incarceration, and this is again from the More Perfect Union deck, if you were returning from incarceration, what would you need to re-engage with society? How would you want to be welcomed back?
Lots of support and guidance on where to find the resources available. Mm-hmm.
Or she says faith, love, support, opportunity.
Yes.
A job and a home without having to check the felon box on everything. And Stephanie says for society to really give you a second chance.
Yes.
I would want a second chance. Mental health support, job training, and jobs that want to hire returning citizens. Love and compassion.
Yes.
Yeah, I would want my family and community to have a party for me. I'm serious, when I came out, I would want them to like embrace me with open arms and tell me how happy they were to have me back and how much they love me and how they, for the people that are closest to me to be there for me, you know, I would want that. Okay, so counseling, job training, or entrepreneurship training, community and family support. Thank you, Alexandra.
Yes. Great discussion.
Yes, thank you everybody for being here. Let's go to the next slide, Andrew. What do we want to amplify? One thing, amplify decarceration. This is when what the man who wrote the book on epidemiology and mass incarceration said about getting people out of prison and prison out of people. What would you like to amplify? Put it in the chat, #amplify. Love, compassion, #amplify. Second chance, #amplify. Let's see some amplifies. What would we like to amplify? Next slide. Amplify change, Andrew says. So Tuesdays and Thursdays are Spanish. We have Spanish webinar tomorrow, and Friday, a Taste of a More Perfect Union Cafe. And then next week, we're moving to discussions about children with disabilities and supporting families with creating equitable outcome, childcare, and children with disabilities. So if you provide services or work with families of children with disabilities, or you know people who have, or you have a child with disabilities, please tune in next week, Monday and Wednesday. Look forward to seeing you. Great talk, people. Thank you, Charles. Amplify equality, amplify equity and laws. Thank you. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And what's the last slide? That's the deck. You could get it on our website. We encourage you to have these and other conversations. Encourage you to have these conversations with others. Talk about it. Share the videos.
Yes.
Explore the privilege. We're not all the same. We don't all have the same experience, but we can come together and assist each other with navigating the world that we're parenting in.